Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Bridging the Gap, part of the Jersey First TV network. I'm AJ Malillo, and as always, I'm joined with the lovely and talented Stephen Rombolo. And today's episode is a very important one. It's a big one. You may know that Earth Day was recently just happened. And so, therefore, we have Chris coming on to talk a little bit about climate change, the importance of climate change, and what our generation really needs to understand and absorb about this issue that's affecting the globe. So I'm going to let Stephen introduce Chris, give a little bit more of a background about how we know him, things along that nature. So Steve, whenever you're ready.
I like that little pun there. Things along that nature. That was good. Chris, I mean, so much to say. Is one of my greatest and longest friends. I have the privilege of knowing him since high school. And Chris, to me, is a perfect example of a Gen Z individual who is not only highly motivated, but highly intelligent on something that he is passionate about. And like AJ had said, with specific regard to climate and activism, and he has a real, what I would call a futurist outlook on moving forward with climate. And I think he's got a very inspiring story. I can't wait to share it with everybody and hopefully inspire some other Gen Zers to, kind of pick up their passions by the mantle and pursue them. Maybe not as aggressively as Chris, because this man works hard and fast, but move towards your goals with passion. So I think without further ado, the man himself, Chris Contos, could give us a little bit of an introduction on who he is in his own words.
Yeah, absolutely. So like many people, I spent my childhood outdoors. And as I grew up and towards the end of high school, I really came to the realization that nature offers clarity. And that's something that I valued. And so throughout my life in general, I've been inspired by the principle of think globally and act locally. So that refers to some of the action that Steve is referring to as well, and involvement in volunteering for a community and being involved in even ocean cleanups and just taking initiative there as well. And so I did my undergraduate studies in electrical and computer engineering, knowing that I always wanted to work within clean energy. And now I'm at Georgia Institute of Technology pursuing my Master of Sustainable Energy and Environmental Management, which is an extremely long degree name, but it basically comes down to sustainable energy policy and economics. So I'm heading to work at this intersection of engineering, economics, and policy, which is extremely exciting area to be. But I would say that the driver of my decision to go into this space was really ignited by an educational opportunity that I had to travel to Ecuador. And there, obviously, with the Galapagos Islands, it's one of the places with the most unique biodiversity, as well as natural geographic features, including volcanoes and ravines. And it was just a very enriching experience. But there I was able to complete some volunteer work with local communities that traditionally practice sustainable initiatives, whether it's agriculture without pesticides, plant-based medicine, and utilizing circular waste management with limited access to electricity. And so this experience of volunteering allowed me to understand systemic challenges, such as the resource scarcity that they faced. And this is perpetuated at an institutional level. And so despite that, these communities were building resilience through regenerative action and being proper stewards of the planet. And something that I took to heart and as an inspiration and really pushed me in this direction of pursuing a career and passion for clean energy. And so that experience really gave me global perspectives on environmental justice, energy, and sustainable practices. And since then, I've been ignited to take action.
Yeah, Chris, if you guys can't tell, Chris is clearly just a brilliant mind, especially when it comes to this. And you also might notice we're obviously going through Zoom this week. That's because, like Chris said, he's down in Georgia. We're up in Jersey. But I wanted to ask you, Chris, a little bit about your growing up on the shore and maybe how that's affected you, because obviously the Jersey Shore, it's one of the biggest landmarks in our state, our beautiful state of New Jersey, and we have some of the best beaches, and you grew up right by the beach. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe even offer some insight about, obviously we deal with hurricanes in New Jersey, so what are some things that maybe can help our shore communities out that you found in your study so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was going to take the first question there in the direction that you brought with regards to hurricanes. So Hurricane Sandy really emphasized the fact that climate and energy crises are the most prominent generational problems that we're facing. So I think that was a very real event that made that self-evident. And so in terms of initiatives that can be taken at the shore, when you think about climate action, it can be really broken out into three categories, being mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering. Most of what is being done at the shore would be adaptation, and that would be things like extending the seashore line via dredging, potential seawalls. And again, in my opinion, this is a good short-term investment, but long-term, we really have to focus on mitigation. So adaptation is this reactive approach to kind of manage the unavoidable and use human technology to potentially reduce damage, but mitigation is that proactive action to take action to reduce emissions that are driving global warming induced events such as sea level rise or more extreme weather events, such as the frequency and intensity of hurricanes at the shore.
So obviously, Stephen has some experience himself with Hurricane Sandy. So I figure that maybe, Steve, you can shed a little bit of light in this situation too, about kind of the effects of what a hurricane really would have on a shore community. You have the firsthand knowledge yourself.
Yeah, I mean, Hurricane Sandy was, I would say, a hallmark event of my life, a major life event. My house is situated perfectly in between the Atlantic Ocean and the Barnegat Bay. And, once Hurricane Sandy kind of rolled through, did her thing, we ended up with a lot of water. But more than that, aside from my personal experiences, my personal losses, I think it revealed something super important, and that is preventative action against these kinds of things is, I would argue, the most important investment that a community in an area like this can make. Like Chris was saying, what we're doing right now is adaptive. I've spent the past, we're coming up on 10 years now since Hurricane Sandy, and I've seen countless attempts to dredge and, truck in sand and build these new dunes, all these temporary things that, one storm comes away and washes away the dunes that we spent millions of federal dollars building. Not a very productive technique or environmentally conscious technique to be trucking in all this, sand to this ecosystem that it is not from. So there's real life effects. And I think what Chris is studying highlights the importance, and like he says, this intersection of so many things. There's climate science, there's bioscience, there's government regulation, there's politics. What do the people want? Because there's a big push here for, not directly related to natural disasters, but there was talk about putting windmill farms offshore that were eventually shot down because people were concerned that it would ruin the appeal of the coastline. So the population has a huge say in how the community is protected and developed in terms of climate change protecting against the effects of climate change. So an event like a hurricane brings a lot of those things to light, and it forces the community to kind of look at that on its face in a very real way. And I think that is probably part of the inspiration for a lot of my personal activism on issues like that. And it's a lot of people around here deal with that. So I'd like to imagine that Chris similarly, and as you were just saying, had those experiences where you saw kind of the fallout of what a disaster like that does to a community and how emotionally and financially draining rebuilding is. So there should be some kind of emphasis on the preventative efforts of that to ease that pressure and that pain once an event like that happens, which is why I'm so glad we have somebody like Chris studying and kind of working and putting himself in a position to affect communities in a prolific way when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%, Stephen. And so that leads me to my next question for Chris, which would be, what do you think are some of the best? Obviously, you talked about how some things on the shores adaptive measures. What do you think are the best preventative measures for the effects of climate change that some communities can do that you've learned so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And so preventative measures would come under that, again, that category of mitigation. And so I would say my studies are focused within energy, and energy as a driver of climate change is of great significance, as approximately 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, which when burned or combusted emit CO2 or other emissions, CO2 being a greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change, and then other emissions such as sulfur dioxide, which affect public health at local areas. So again, this is an issue of multiple jurisdictions where you have local pollution and global pollution as well. But as far as mitigation goes, again, within the energy space, I would say that retrofits and improving energy efficiency of your home are extremely important. And then also advocating or even purchasing low carbon energy sources or renewables as well. So that could either include an investment in a rooftop solar system, but again, it has a high capital cost, and there are barriers and equity issues of these technologies, especially as they are scaling in markets. But that would be a fantastic first step, would be to look at your home energy usage, or even reach out to your utility and ask for an energy audit, which would give you insight into your energy use, and then adapt accordingly, and potentially reduce your peak demand, which would also save you money as well. So there's a lot of opportunity, even at the residential level, to reduce energy consumption via energy efficiency or purchasing renewables, to really reduce your own carbon footprint. So,
and what do you think about the governmental level? And then I'll let Stephen, unless you want to hop in right now. Okay. So what about the governmental level?
Yeah, at the governmental level, again, we're dealing with multiple levels of governance. So you have this local or regional opportunity, but you can also go federal or even global. And that's something that we've seen with regards to ozone depleting substances. When the ozone layer was threatened, there was an international agreement, the Montreal Protocol, where countries came together and said, okay, like we have to stop emitting these ozone depleting substances and save the ozone layer to protect our atmosphere. And so that's an example of extremely successful global legislation. But there has yet to be as successful action, although there are global commitments primarily made through the United Nations to take climate action. And so as far as, I'll start with local and regional. So what we've seen in the US, and primarily governance gives you the opportunity to use a variety of policy mechanisms, whether it be command and control regulation, which is less politically feasible and popular. That would be something like a carbon tax. And a lot of proposed carbon taxes are industry specific, in the same way that there are market-based mechanisms such as a cap and trade program, where you would set an emissions threshold over an industry, such as power plants in a specific geographic region. So you'd set a maximum emissions for that year and then create tradable permits that power plants can then trade between them. So that is cost effective in the way that power plants that can adopt technologies to reduce or abate their emissions, the cheapest will do so first, and then where it's expensive, those power plants would purchase permits for that year. So again, there's this net reduction of emissions, but yeah. So as far as governance goes, it's their role to implement those kinds of programs, whether it be command and control as they see fit, which might be the route taken just due to the urgency of the situation, or if there's these market-based mechanisms or even incentives. And so a lot of the incentives that I discussed with regards to utilities, such as like for home audits or retrofitting or commercial retrofitting, those are typically funded through state or federal money. And so incentives offer this bonus of taking action, but they still don't address the root problem of using fossil fuels, and they don't disincentivize the use of fossil fuel extraction or use. So there's a lot of mechanisms that governments can leverage. But again, it's about finding the best solution for a community or for a nation. One of the benefits of having federal policy is that it prevents program leakage. So for example, in the northeastern US, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and trade program amongst power plants in that region. But there has been leakage where they set the emissions cap, but then electricity is just purchased from another state that's using fossil fuel. So there's potential leakage from these programs where a federal piece of legislation or program would prevent that leakage, at least within the nation. But again, there are disadvantages as well with relation to innovation, or even like the opportunity to promote rent seeking, or basically free riders within that program. So it really depends, but I'm personally a huge advocate for more of the local or regional governance, where you do have the benefits of innovation and flexibility, and also a closer fit between the policy and preferences of a specific community. So,
I mean, obviously you spoke about a lot of things there, and there's plenty of things you can pick and choose to talk about. What seems interesting to me to kind of explore your thoughts on is, you said that you prefer the concept of local governance because of this connection to community, innovation, so many reasons. I think one thing that I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on is the concept of sort of equitable access to these kinds of technologies in these local communities. Because when you look at the lens of climate through, a national level, obviously there are these inequities regionally based on so many things, demographics, socioeconomics. Even when you take that lens and you bring it down to the local level, to the state, the county, the town even, those inequities still exist. And I imagine that that is a huge barrier in tackling the climate issue. So what are your perspectives on that? And then a second question to that is, how do you incorporate Generation Z, younger individuals, into that? Because we're not homeowners, we can't go out and buy solar panels to put on our houses, and there's only so much we could do as we're entering the real world and this kind of new stage of adulthood. I'm curious what your opinions and sort of recommendations would be there.
Yeah, absolutely. So in relation to equity issues and barriers, like you mentioned, there is the barrier of high capital cost. So we do need more government funded programs to support people in initially adopting these technologies. I mean, that's what we're seeing from a lot of utilities. Is what they're doing is they're creating programs where you can have on-bill financing. So you can get this retrofit done, you can get this new HVAC unit that's more efficient and reduces your energy demand, but then you just pay it back over time. So programs like that are huge in terms of expanding access to these technologies, whether it be rooftop solar, electric vehicles, or even heat pumps, which are something that are actually the least partisan climate solution. And the heat pumps are basically an equivalent of an HVAC system for your home. They just typically don't require natural gas. They run on electricity, and they're highly efficient. So yeah, there are a lot of barriers, but there are a lot of solutions being proposed as well. And something I can speak to as well is what's called energy burden, and that's basically the percentage of household annual income that is spent on energy bills. So if it's above 6%, it's deemed high energy burden. So that is something that we should be paying attention to from a legislative perspective, is looking at these regions with high energy burdens and providing programs and assistance to aid in addressing retrofits or improving their access to more efficient technologies. So for example, in a lot of low-income communities, they don't even sell highly efficient light bulbs or LEDs. Like, they just offer like older technologies that are available, despite even the more efficient technologies being affordable in the same price and having lifetime savings. So here you are buying this inefficient piece of technology that you're not only paying the same for up front, but then over its lifetime, you're paying higher costs as well, which again is not, it's just accentuating the problem even further. So.
Uh, so when it comes to this, I want to take a little bit of a I'll say a bird's eye view, from the situation. And obviously there's a lot going on in the world, and we can't touch it all in one brief interview. So from that bird's eye view, obviously energy is a big deal in the news right now because of obviously the conflict in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine, obviously the war. So a lot on one side of the political aisle is talking about how we at one time were more energy independent and we would be able to quickly basically prevent as much of an issue when it comes to oil prices and things of that nature. They point to a country like Germany, who really pushed heavy for this green energy and then was still reliant on Russia for a lot of their oil needs because they still needed oil. So you have opportunities in green energy in wind and solar, but we've seen that the batteries that are there don't really last that long right now, and they're not the most effective going forward. So when you look at this bird's eye view, what do you think is the best solution for countries so that we don't have to turn around and basically crawl on our hands and knees to a country like Saudi Arabia, who has human rights violations, or Iran or Russia, or these countries that quite frankly are not the most ethical countries on the globe? How can the Western world and then the developing world sort of kneecap those countries and stop their dominance in this field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's going back to their dominance. What we're seeing is they're using funds from their carbon resources to then reinvest to potentially be leaders elsewhere. So I know Saudi Arabia is leading initiatives on hydrogen energy, which is clean energy. So I think that they're not looking to dominate oil forever. And they are pivoting, and that's a signal for us to pivot as well and adapt. So I think the main dependence in Germany is based on natural gas, especially for heating. A lot of homes and commercial buildings are dependent on natural gas for heating. And Nord Stream 2 would have provided extreme relief there, but obviously it was actually, its certification was extended last fall and obviously further extended now because of the conflict in Ukraine. And so Germany's, I think, fatal flaw was its push to pivot from nuclear. And so that's something that is controversial, is nuclear energy. But with the onset of small modular reactors reaching close to commercialization, there is a huge opportunity to leverage nuclear power as a low carbon energy source to at least aid in this transition. And the hope is that these small modular reactors will have a faster deployment time, because when you think of a nuclear power plant, it takes an extremely large amount of capital and time to construct and even operate. And so there's only actually one nuclear power plant being built right now in the US, and that's Vogtle in Georgia. And it's both over budget and delayed. So in terms of public opinion on nuclear, at least in the US, it's a very difficult and touchy subject. And so Germany is actually extending their nuclear decommissioning. So they do have a few plants that are being brought back online to prevent short-term reliance on fossil fuel. But again, I don't have all the answers there, but that is something that I do actually advocate for, is the expansion of nuclear power, despite the challenges of post-fuel storage. And again, there are a bunch of opportunities with hydrogen energy as well. But yeah, I think now we are in a very difficult landscape where you do have this transition to clean energy, but it's about what's in between. What we're seeing domestically is this dependence on natural gas. So a perfect example is Georgia Power, which is one of the largest utilities in the US, and it's in an unregulated electricity market, wholesale electricity market. So meaning they basically have full control over their decisions. But what's interesting is that they are actually proposing in their new plan for the next 3 years to purchase natural gas from other states, which is very interesting. So they're pivoting to this commitment to natural gas instead of investing in potential opportunities in energy efficiency or even demand response. And what demand response is they provide payments for consumers to reduce their electricity consumption during either critical peaking periods of the electric grid. So there are other opportunities that we can leverage, mainly being energy efficiency and demand response. And there's a lot of potential there that has been untapped. So I would say in terms of further relying on fossil fuel, that's definitely the path to go. And that's what we've seen with Germany. So they've adopted all of this clean energy, but they've kept electricity prices relatively competitive. And that was through energy efficiency and reducing the intensity of stressing their electric grid. So I think that is the lowest lying fruit that hasn't been realized to its fullest potential.
So I think it might be interesting to talk briefly about, only because it was mentioned, your personal experiences with nuclear energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know
Yeah, so in summer 2019, I worked in Salem at the Salem nuclear power plant in South Jersey as a systems engineer with PSE&G. And that gave me a lot of insight into the reliability of nuclear power, as well as its benefits on economic development in a specific region. So again, that experience was really transformative for me in being a proponent for that technology. So,
and in terms of, I don't know if you have, a general idea of the numbers, but New Jersey, we do have a few nuclear power plants here, like you had mentioned down in Salem. We used to have one right in Lacey, which is locally near, where AJ and I, all three of us are from. That was decommissioned a few years ago. Do you see a feasible future for nuclear power in New Jersey?
Yes. So the challenge with nuclear in the US now is a lot of power plants are reaching their lifetime or are close to. So there will be this wave of a huge retirement of these nuclear power plants that provide a lot of energy to certain states. So like New Jersey, for example, I believe that their electricity generation is led by nuclear. So that decommissioning would have a huge impact on their energy landscape. And it's really a question of how can we replace that? And what's interesting about nuclear is that there are these huge capacity power plants that are always running. So they provide the baseload power for basically the entire state. Baseload meaning like the lowest, like basically what you can think of in terms of dispatching for the electricity grid is you have your baseload and then any additional generation provided to the grid. And then you have peaking power plants. So nuclear really serves as that foundation, that bedrock for serving people's energy needs. So yeah, we're really at a crossroads where, again, like a lot of the power plants in the US were built in like the 70s, nuclear power plants in the US. And so, yeah, it's going to be an interesting a challenge to navigate domestically. And that's where I hope at least these small modular reactors or potentially even geothermal could play a role in substituting for nuclear. Again, depending on the geographic region, which again points to this idea of local solutions. So some areas have access to geothermal, some don't, and some areas also have higher potential for solar energy generation, such as California or some of the Midwestern states, while others have more opportunity for wind, specifically in the Midwest as well. So it really depends on customizing these energy solutions for specific regions to then have something that we can boast about internationally of this is the US and its clean energy future. So there's a lot of opportunity, but again, there is this huge challenge of this mass or potential mass retirement of nuclear power plants.
So Chris, I had this thought. as you were speaking, and feel free to completely shut this down because you're much more expert than I am in something like this. But obviously, New Jersey is a coastal state, and you're saying that we're going to be losing all of these nuclear power plants. And now I was thinking maybe this is something that could help not only produce energy, but also protect from swells and things like that from a storm. Is there any way in sort of like how the Hoover Dam is a hydroelectric, obviously it also produces hydroelectricity. Is there any possible way that we can maybe invest something like a seawall, which could help with the swells, but then also use that to produce hydroelectricity? Because as you said, it's all about the availability. And I mean, I would say we probably have the largest, well, the second largest availability to water beside behind the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean being right on New Jersey's doorstep, literally.
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
traditional hydro generators are mostly river-based just because the consistency of flow. But there are a lot of companies globally working on basically wave energy. And so instead of taking advantage of power flowing, these devices will actually bob up and down and gain energy that way. There is also the potential for obviously offshore wind traditionally, but now what we're seeing is the first commercialization of actually floating wind turbines. So instead of being anchored to the ocean floor directly, there's now opportunity for floating turbines, which would be extremely useful on the Jersey Shore. And so that's something that I'm really looking at now as kind of a pillar of the future of offshore wind. So that's something I'm very excited about, and I think that there is huge potential there. So it's, in terms of hydroelectric, I don't think it's as feasible just due to the physical mechanism. But again, there is potential opportunity to pilot some of these newer buoy type technologies.
awesome. So Steve, if you have a final question or two, I'll let you take it.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Chris, you have a high level of, expertise in this area, and you've given us a lot of great information. I'm curious, what would be your recommendation to, let's say, somebody like me who still lives on the Jersey Shore, who, doesn't have your phone number and can't call you and ask you these questions? What are some good resources for people to kind of get in touch with these issues, understand this innovation a little bit better? Because I think a big part of, not to be ironic about it, but bridging this gap in understanding the climate crisis we're in, and it sort of feels like we're reaching, like you're saying, this nexus point where we're going to have to address this because there are these plants coming, they're going to be decommissioned, and we have this right now, presently, this crisis with fossil fuels. Where can your average New Jerseyan find out about these issues, find out about the innovation, and form, real solid and legitimate opinions on these things? So when it comes time for the government to act, the population can be, thoughtful and intelligent advocates for what they believe is the best solution.
Yeah, so absolutely. What I would point people to is what's called Project Drawdown. And they are an initiative that is focused on helping the world reach drawdown, which is this point in the future where greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline, which is an indicator of halting climate change. And so what Project Drawdown does is they design models to identify the top global solutions. And so with this global framework, what's actually been done here at Georgia with Dr. Marilyn Brown, who I work under, she's created this initiative called Drawdown Georgia, which takes this global framework and localizes it to the state of Georgia to identify the top solutions for that region. So of the 100 drawdown solutions identified, they identified the top 20 for Georgia specifically. But I would say it's a great resource to get an overview of, like you said, a wide scope of innovation across various sectors, whether it be agriculture, electricity, et cetera. It's definitely a phenomenal resource, and they have great visuals to show where emissions are coming from, and again, different solutions across different sectors. So
awesome. So just unfortunately, we are running out of time here. So before we ask our fun closer question that we typically do. I just want to ask, where can people find you and reach out to you or see what you're doing and what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can actually, I'm going to drop my email in chat, or I could just say it out
All
loud.
right.
It's actually,
You could say your email out loud
yeah,
if you're comfortable
both.
with that, or your
Yeah,
Twitter handle, whatever.
Yeah, it's contos@gatech.edu. So contos@gatech.edu. So you can feel free to reach out with any questions whenever. And I'd be happy to talk about climate, energy, or even solutions outside of my domain. So thank you.
Awesome, Chris. Awesome.
Can I tack on one more? Would you be able to just kind of, because I think it's important for people to know, a short version of the long list of things that you've worked on professionally and academically, just so these people know, how legit you are, as if this conversation wasn't proof enough. But
True.
Back to your, yes, I will do that. But first, I just wanted to address your question about what can people do, because that's something that slipped out mid conversation. And so I would kind of categorize action into like 3 categories of like food, water, and energy. And a lot of people working at the intersection of those, they call it the food, water, energy nexus. But basically the principles surrounding like individual action relating to food could be reducing food waste, which is actually a huge source of emissions. As food goes to landfill and decomposes, it releases methane. Potentially considering eating less meat, specifically red meat. So again, that's something that doesn't have to be a transformative step in your diet. It could just be something that you do on Mondays. You don't eat meat on Mondays. Like that is something that is contributing to reducing your carbon footprint. And you can also advocate and support more sustainable farming systems. And then as far as water usage goes, you can invest in, again, high efficiency appliances or shower heads and faucets. And you can also potentially replace irrigated lawns with drip irrigation systems, which are just as effective. They're just more efficient. And then in relation to energy, we talked a lot about energy efficiency and heating and electricity, but you can also drive less or even more, like purchase more efficient vehicles. And again, the challenge of this is that there are a lot of these high initial capital costs. And that's something that is being addressed with federal subsidies. But again, we have to do better. And you can also share what you learn with others as well. So I think that there's extreme value there. And then back to the original question of what have I worked on recently? And so a lot of my focus with my time with Georgia Tech has been in a lot of places. So the research that I'm doing now is focused on consumer behavior and adoption of these sustainable home technologies, whether it's an electric vehicle, a heat pump, or rooftop solar. But I've also done more on the technical and policy side. So technical, where I did an analysis on transmission lines, the actual material composition of them, and what are the sustainable alternatives that we have. So as we further develop clean energy solutions and deploy them in the US, where the highest potential is usually furthest, or not furthest, but far from load centers being cities, we do need to develop infrastructure, transmission infrastructure in the US further. So that was an analysis that I did there. I also actually did look at climate policy and its impacts on energy security. And despite mixed solutions, there were strong indicators that it does enhance energy security in reducing your national dependence on OPEC or oil exporting companies as well. And I've also looked at specifically within the New York metropolitan area. I did an analysis on bus electrification and opportunities there. I've looked at the cost benefit versus solar and natural gas here in Georgia. I've done a sustainability consulting project to identify policy opportunities for an industrial company. And that I think is where there's a lot of value to be had, and a lot more work needs to be done as well. So yeah, I've done a lot of work, but again, this is something that I'm passionate about, and I appreciate you guys inviting me and taking the time for this interview.
Of course, and really quick, Chris, before we ask our wrap up question, just for the people in the back, how old are you?
22.
22 years old, and he's done all of this, and that's not to say anything other than this is Gen Z, one of our best and brightest, I'll say, of the future, and the fact that you can do and make changes at a young age. If you find what you are passionate about, everybody has something that they're passionate about. Maybe it's not energy, and maybe you don't think it's as important as energy, but I'm going to tell you something. It is as important, because whatever you have to offer is just as important as what Chris has to offer, what I have to offer, what Stephen has to offer. So find whatever it is that makes you passionate, whether it's energy or something else, and run with it, just like we saw Chris do.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, climate change is something that does take this collective effort of every skill imaginable. So whether you're on the policy end, you're on the engineering end, you're on the marketing end, on the business end, like every hand is needed. And I actually will take a moment to plug a resource. It's called climatebase.org. And it's a web-based service to match you with jobs of your interest within the climate space. So if you are interested in either starting your career in climate or pivoting, being mid-career, it is a resource that you can look at to see what types of opportunities are available.
Awesome, Chris. So Steve, I'll let you pick of our favorite fun questions. I'll let you pick whichever one you want to ask Chris.
Oh, come on. This is, I feel like we have to roll with it. There's a lot of great New Jerseyans, Chris, musicians specifically. But, you know, in the battle of the greats, you know, who is going to stand on top when it comes to classic Jersey musicians? It's always this power struggle between Bruce Springsteen and Bon Jovi. Whose side are you taking? Who are you riding with to the top?
That is a very tough question, but I think I'm going to roll with Springsteen. That's my answer.
Springsteen, a Springsteen man, a man after Stephen's own heart. Look at that.
Listen, a lot of the Springsteen lyrics have to do with the beautiful environment of New Jersey. I get it. It makes sense.
Absolutely. You know what? Just for fun, and just because I love Chris and I want to hear his answer to this, because I've been thinking about it too. All right, I'm going to ask you a second one of the questions, just because you're you, Chris. Okay. So let's say you're on a road trip, right? But we'll put you, we usually say like in a van or something, but that's not very eco-friendly. So you're in a cyber truck, you know, or an Elon Musk's Tesla truck, whatever you want, right? You're going on a road trip across the country, Jersey to California. Who are you taking with you? They could be dead or alive. A little Bon Jovi reference for you right there. But they could be dead or alive. Who are you taking?
Ooh, that is a very difficult question. Honestly, I'm gonna take Steve. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen.
So
that was sweet. Look at that, Steve.
So wholesome. So wholesome.
All right, and with that, that was another edition of Bridging the Gap with AJ Melillo.
Stephen Rombolo.
So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. And we'll see you next week on Bridging the Gap.